just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water, pick up the biggest D20 you've got and give it a roll. It's Red Dice Diaries with a RPG review of the new D&D 5th edition, the latest edition, Players Handbook. As I've said in this video, I'm reviewing the Dungeons & Dragons Players Handbook 5th edition. It's by various authors and is a fantasy RPG that clocks in at around about 300 pages. Now, unless you're only just getting into RPGs, and if you are, welcome to what I hope will be a long stay in a wonderful and rewarding hobby. Or you've been living on the moon for the last few months, then you'll be aware of the release of the 5th edition of the world's most well-known RPG. Paizo have released freely available playtest rules packets in the run-up to the release. I did a first looks video based on that, which I'll put a link to up there. This video is about and they followed that with the release of a boxed beginners set and a set of basic rules available freely on the web. And I'll put a link to those freely available rules down below so you can have a look at those. Now, I think it's fair to say that the previous 4th edition of the D&D game had a mixed reception, and it'd be hard to imagine that that did not contribute to the relatively quick decision to release a new 5th edition of the game. But I'm going to do my best in this review to consider the game on its own merit and not compare it overly much to previous editions, although of course I will point out where mechanics and concepts differ or they've been carried over from previous editions. The game uses a D20 mechanic. To accomplish a task, a player rolls a D20, adds an attribute, strength, dexterity, etc. modifier, and if they are proficient in an appropriate skill, a proficiency bonus based on the class level of their character. In order to succeed in a roll, they need to either beat a difficulty number set by the GM, if it's an unopposed roll, or the number rolled by their opponent, if it's an opposed roll. An interesting wrinkle here is the advantage and disadvantage mechanic, where a player rolls an extra d20 and then picks either the highest or the lowest dice roll to use depending on whether they have the advantage or the disadvantage. But I'll talk more about that later in the review. So looking at the preface and introduction, the preface is written by Mike Merles and it gives a potted history of D&D and also covers the by now obligatory what is roleplay write-up. I like the emphasis that Mike places on D&D as a collaborative social experience. It's also gratifying to see the concept of DM improvement and adapting a system enshrined from the very start of the book. The introduction gives a brief description of the book's contents and how running a game works. It also introduces the basic concepts behind the system at this point. I was pleased to see them introduced so early. I've always been a fan of games with a strong central core mechanic, rather than systems where a lot of different rules have been bolted together into an unwieldy monstrosity of Frankenstein's monster-esque proportions. The basic mechanic, rolling a d20 and adding modifiers to beat a target number, will be familiar to most role players. The intro also defines what the authors believe to be the core concepts of the game, referring to them as the 3 pillars of adventure, and these are exploration, social interaction and combat. These cover a fairly wide selection of situations in D&D, although I would like to have seen character growth mentioned here as well, and I was gratified to see that combat wasn't at the top of the list. Part 1 of the book begins with the first chapter, which is called Step by Step Characters, and as the name suggests, it takes you through building a character step by step. Effectively, you choose a race, choose a class, determine ability scores, describe your character, choose your equipment, and then there's a little segment titled Come Together where you describe how your characters have met up and formed a party. There's not much surprising in this chapter. The races that everyone's familiar with, elves, dwarves, etc., are present, as are the standard Dungeons & Dragons classes. However, there are a few interesting additions, such as tieflings, humans with the blood of demons or devils, dragonborn, the by now almost obligatory dragon men, drow, evil elves driven below the surface. Skills also seem to have been vastly simplified, with every character being proficient in certain skills and receiving a flat bonus, based on their level, to those skills that they have proficiency in. Now, I'm sure this won't go down overly well with everybody, since it does condense down the skill list, and it does mean you can't really have the situation where, for instance, you could be highly skilled at sword fighting but less skilled with a bow. You might have a generic combat skill. Now, as I say, this won't be popular with everybody. Personally, for me, I'm greatly a fan of it. I'd quite happily sacrifice any notions of realism in order to streamline the rules and get a more concise, focused gaming experience. Beyond the standard races, there are also sub-races, for instance, mountain or hill dwarves for dwarves, with their own characteristics, and this allows for more customization, which can only be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Overall, the chapter is very clearly written, and the authors take you through it as they build a sample character called Bruenor the Dwarven Fighter, and it's nice to actually see how they go through the motions of building a character. Chapter 2 begins with a picture of an iconic adventuring party, although one of them would appear to be a drow, resting around a fire, and it deals with the various different races. For me, this picture sums up the contents of the chapter very well. The chapter feels very comfortable to any experienced role player. There are no unwelcome surprises for anyone who's ever played a fantasy roleplay game before, and it's easy enough to get into for someone who's maybe not quite as familiar with it. However, there are a few interesting little tweaks and wrinkles here and there that expand the races section beyond just the traditional faux medieval fantasy fare. Each race under discussion has a 3 or 4 page spread that covers the following info: ability score modifiers, some races being better at things than others in general; age, how rapidly or slowly a race ages and when they are considered an adult; alignment, the general tendencies of a particular race, although the book does take some time to point out that it is not binding as far as player characters are concerned, it's simply a generalisation; size, how large or small a race is, along with any bonuses or penalties that accrue as a result; speed, how fast a member of that race moves; languages, the languages that a player character gains access to specifically as a feature of their race; and sub-races, an interesting extra option. Most races in the book have a couple of sub-races. Elf, for instance, have 3, which is High Elf, Wood Elf and Drow, and these add some additional modifiers and provide an interesting bit of divergence and background for player characters. I'm very much in favour of increased choice for players, and expect that the number of sub-races will grow as further 5th edition books are released. I only hope it doesn't get too ridiculous. The races and sub-races covered are as follows: dwarves have hill and mountain dwarf sub-races; elves, as discussed, have high elf, wood elf and drow sub-races; halflings have lightfoot and stout sub-races; there are also humans and dragonborn; gnomes have forest and rock gnome sub-races; and there are half-elves, half-orcs and tieflings. Most of these races are pretty much what you'd expect. Dwarves are still tradition-bound and stoic; half-orcs inherit a savage streak from their orcish blood; tieflings are still mistrusted because of their infernal taint in their veins; and elves are still magical creatures with a long-lived worldview that often frustrates other races. Now, much as I'm not particularly fond of the Dragonborn as a race, I think it's nice that they're included for people who want to play a draconic character at starting level. I mean, this is Dungeons and Dragons after all. The inclusion of tieflings was also welcome, since I've always found them an interesting race, marked as they are by the touch of the infernal. It's a shame that the Aasimars, which are humans with divine provenance in their blood and the opposite number to tieflings, were not included in the book, but I expect they'll make an appearance in a future supplement. The races sections are neatly laid out and provide a snapshot of each of the races, along with a couple of paragraphs summarising the views that that race commonly holds of others. For example, dwarves find elves flighty and frivolous, but admire the feats of craftsmanship that elven artificers are capable of, whereas they find halflings friendly folk, but don't take them seriously due to their race's lack of achievement. Modifiers for race seem to come in the following format: characteristic modifiers. Some races have additional visual spectrums, such as dark vision. Races can have advantages in some areas relevant to their race. For example, toughness and resisting poison for dwarves, and perception and resisting charm magic for elves. They also gain proficiency with certain weapons, skills and tools commonly used by that race. Although I tend not to play humans in fantasy games very often, the section on humans does do a very good job of making them seem like an attractive alternative to the more fantastic races on offer, painting humankind as a more dynamically motivated and versatile race than the others. There is a brief discussion of human ethnicities and how this will affect appearance and naming conventions, although the only examples given are the 9 most commonly recognised ethnicities from the Forgotten Realms setting. Given that this is largely for background flavour, it wouldn't be very difficult at all to come up with your own ethnicities or expand on this information, and I'm sure we'll see further expansion of this as 5th edition campaign settings are published. Chapter 3 deals with classes. Now, love it or hate it, character class is at the very heart of D&D. For those who don't know what a character class is, essentially it's a broad occupational term, fighter, cleric, druid, ranger, etc., that defines the path a character's abilities will take to some degree. For example, a fighter will specialise in some form or forms of combat, a cleric is shaped by the divinity they follow and wields magic power in their name. A druid often harkens back to an older, more natural faith, one more at home with the wilderness and wild places of the world, whereas a ranger is a hunter and tracker who moves silently through the undergrowth stalking their prey. The following classes are featured in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The Barbarian, a savage primitive warrior. The Bard, an inspiring performer who weaves together music and magic. Clerics, devout champions of the gods. Druids, priests of the old faith wielding the power of nature. Fighters, masters of martial combat. Monks, masters of martial arts honing their own body into a weapon. Paladins, who are holy warriors bound to an oath. Rangers, warriors at one with nature who combat threats on the border of civilization and beyond. Rogues are scoundrels who make their way in the world using stealth and trickery. Sorcerers are spellcasters who draw power and magic from their own blood, and warlocks are magic users who have gained their power from bargaining with extraplanar entities. Last but not least is the wizard, a scholarly magic user who memorises arcane formulae and spells. The chapter begins with a handy summary table that provides a brief description of the classes and also some useful game information, such as what hit dice they use, what the class's primary ability is, what saving throws they count as being proficient in, i.e. strength and constitution for fighters, intelligence and wisdom for wizards, and what weapons and armour they are proficient in using. Rather like the races chapter, each class gets a few pages spread that discusses how the various classes might fit in a typical D&D world. I particularly liked the creating a, insert name of class, section, where a couple of paragraphs offer some handy hints and suggestions that a player might want to think about when creating a character of a particular class. For example, in the Creating a Barbarian section, it encourages a player to think about where the barbarian came from and what led them to the adventuring life, offering a number of possible suggestions. I think this is great for both beginners and seasoned D&D veterans. It never hurts to have a few questions posed you to start the creative juices flowing when you're making a character, and this is a great inclusion in the book. I was very pleased to see it. Each character class has a number of abilities gained at the levels shown in the various write-ups that allow them to bend or break the rules in their particular area of expertise. For instance, a barbarian can enter a frenzied rage to increase his potency in combat, whilst a bard can play soothing music to inspire others, just to give 2 examples. Most of the classes also add an additional level of customization at around about 2nd or 3rd level, when a character chooses a particular path that they will walk. This works similarly to sub-races, building on the basic class abilities and slanting the character in a certain direction. For example, at 2nd level, druids choose either the Circle of the Land, which emphasises a mystical connection to a particular type of land or terrain, or the Circle of the Moon, which focuses on guarding the wild and mastering shape-changing. At 3rd level, fighters choose an archetype, either champion, developing their raw power to high levels, battle master, mastering manoeuvres and controlling the battlefield, or the Eldritch Knight, a warrior who supplements their martial prowess with careful application of magical power. Now, I love this idea because it allows members of ostensibly the same class to vary from each other, providing rich fodder for background in Campaign World. For instance, you might ask yourself, what is the relationship between those druids who join with the land and those who savagely run on the night of the full moon with the beasts? It also seems to incorporate the best element of kits from AD&D and the different party roles from D&D 4th Ed, without adding slews of extra rules and complication. There's also a lot of potential for future expansion and customization there. Now, I'm not going to go into all the abilities here since it would make the review far too long, but the abilities for the particular classes really do reinforce that class's main shtick or concept. I particularly like the Sorcerer, which was always a favourite class of mine in D&D 3.5, and how they can either have dragon blood running through their veins or wild magic to explain their powers. Wild magic in particular can result in some strange effects ranging from the merely odd, a Modron appearing within 5 foot of you and then disappearing after a minute, to the deadly, each creature within 30 foot of you taking 1d10 necrotic damage. Sorcerers have less spells to call on than wizards, but they do have sorcery points which they can use to alter and twist their spells, making them far more versatile. The Warlock is another favourite of mine. I remember a version of it from D&D 4th Ed, although it may have appeared in earlier editions, I'm not sure. Let me know in the comments box if you know this. Warlocks are defined by a pact with an extra-planar entity that grants them magical powers. The Player's Handbook offers you a choice of the Archfey, a Lord or Lady Fey of vast power, the Fiend, a demon or a devil from the lower planes, or the Great Old One. That's right, you can't keep Cthulhu and the Mythos out of D&D. As the creatures that you have a pact with. Warlocks seem to have less spells than even the Sorcerers, but they supplement their abilities with invocations, effectively semi-permanent magical abilities gained at certain levels. I think both of these two classes have a great deal of roleplay potential, and whilst not exactly new, they are far less tried and tested than the other classes in the book. It's nice to see D&D doing something a little different and branching out, while still maintaining the core concepts that originally made it popular. Chapter 4 is the personality and background chapter, and this is one of the chapters in the book that I was most looking forward to. After all, whilst it's great and interesting to know what abilities your character is going to have for their class and race, at the end of the day, D&D is a role-playing game after all, and nothing gets role-playing off to a greater start as far as I'm concerned than having a character with a compelling background that's chock full of plot hooks and with a personality that you find enjoyable and you want to invest your time and emotions in. However, getting that across in print form can be very tricky, since everyone has a different idea of what makes a good background, so I was interested to see what the authors of D&D 5th edition had to say on the subject. The chapter begins with a fairly standard run-through defining name, gender, physical characteristics, and how this might be affected by the race of the character. This is all useful stuff, but it didn't exactly set my world on fire, although like I say, it's very useful to have. Where the chapter really begins to take off, in my opinion, is in the discussion of alignment and languages. Now, there are a number of alignments in D&D, exemplifying particular worldviews. These are lawful good, chaotic good, lawful neutral, neutral, chaotic neutral, lawful evil, neutral evil, and chaotic evil. The book does a great job in laying out, using just a sentence or two for each, how people of these alignments typically behave. To give a couple of examples, lawful good people can be counted upon to do the right thing as expected by society, whereas chaotic evil creatures act with arbitrary violence, motivated entirely by their greed, hatred, or bloodlust. The discussion of different languages, whilst short, lays out the core languages in a basic D&D setting and what script they are written in, along with a smattering of more exotic languages. Also, there are visual representations of Dwarvish, Elvish and Draconic script along the bottom of the page, and these would be great for any GM seeking to make compelling handouts or visual aids for their game. I hope the two scripts that are missing from the Player's Handbook, Infernal and Celestial, will be in a later book, perhaps the Dungeon Master's Guide, I hope. The chapter goes on to suggest that a player pick 2 personality traits, self-descriptions that specifically make your character stand out in the crowd, an ideal, something that drives your character forward, a bond, which is a connection to a person, place or thing, and a flaw, which is a vice, compulsion or weakness. Now, a lot of people might already come up with such backgrounds from their character or not require such a codified system. However, for people who struggle with this part of the game, or who maybe require a little more prompting, it's great that the game seeks to enshrine these concepts at the heart of the system, even providing a system-based reward for them. The GM can give what's referred to as inspiration to players for playing their traits well. When it's spent, inspiration automatically gives the player the advantage, which, if you remember from earlier, gives you the ability to roll 2d20 and pick the highest result for your rolls. Inspiration cannot be stockpiled for multiple uses. You either have it or you don't. However, a player can give up their inspiration to another player that they think has roleplayed particularly well. I think this is a positive step and will hopefully encourage players to show appreciation for the roleplay of their fellows and vice versa. Characters also select a background, for example, acolyte, charlatan, criminal, etc. These provide suggestions for appropriate characteristics and some tables of random suggestions for personality traits. They also give proficiency in 2 appropriate skills. For example, the criminal background grants proficiency in deception and stealth. They give access to a selection of themed equipment and a single feature which is a background element or some contacts that can be called on. For instance, an acolyte can request shelter in the houses of the faithful, whilst an outlander is used to surviving in the wilderness, being able to gather food for herself and up to 5 other people per day. This is an extra level of customization and encourages people to think more about the backgrounds of their characters, which can only be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. Now, chapter 5 of the book is the equipment chapter, and to be honest, I don't normally find equipment chapters particularly interesting in roleplay books. In my experience, they're mostly just dry lists of stuff that you may or may not want to buy. If you're lucky, there'll be some cool artwork or unusual kit that can spark some ideas for stories. But to be honest, the 5th edition Players Handbook does a pretty good job with its equipment chapter. The artwork is nice and clear, breaking up what otherwise could have been quite a dull chapter. The chapter reminds me of a pile of junk lying in a second-hand shop. There's a few gems in this chapter lurking amidst the normal clutter, if you look for them. In particular, I'm very fond of the trinket table. Effectively, each starting character can roll on this table once to get some random piece of very minor equipment at character gen. Now, I'm not normally a fan of random tables, but the items on offer are strictly curiosities, ranging from a tiny gnome-crafted music box playing songs from your childhood to a petrified mouse. Most of these are quite amusing and interesting. They're also another handy thing to hook plot and stories on. You might be asking yourself the question, where did the mouse come from? How did it get turned to stone? And why on earth do you keep it? You may also ask yourself, what song does the music box play? Is it an heirloom of some kind? Or is your character a friend to the gnomish race? Anything that gets you to ask and answer questions about your character's background has to be a positive thing for giving your characters more verisimilitude and more texture to them. We move on to chapter 6, which is called customization options. Now, when I saw this entry in the contents page, I was a little unsure of what it would contain, given that the race, class and background chapters already offer a fair degree of customization. But it opens by dealing with that often maligned aspect of D&D, multi-classing, allowing you to combine levels from one class with those of another. In order to qualify for a new class, unlike when you pick your initial class, you must meet certain characteristic minimums. For example, if you wanted to multi-class into the fighter class, you must have strength 13. Effectively, you then start adding the abilities from your new class level and a tweaked version of the new class's proficiencies to your existing character. These rules all seem fairly straightforward and would involve a minimum of hassle and fuss for the would-be multi-classer. An optional system for feats is also presented in this chapter, although I'm pleased to see it contains nowhere near as ridiculous a number of feats as D&D 3.5. Effectively, when a player is offered a chance to increase their characteristic by advancing in a level in their class, if this system is in use, then they may take a feat instead, allowing them an additional ability rather than a raw power boost. I think this is fine and would probably work quite well as long as D&D doesn't fall into the trap of just releasing supplements containing endless different feats. Part 2 of the book begins with Chapter 7, called Using Ability Scores. Now, most tests in the game revolve around the use of one of the game's 6 characteristics: Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma. Each characteristic has a score and an associated modifier. Characters also have a proficiency bonus based on their class and level. In order to make a test, a player adds their characteristic modifier to their proficiency bonus, if applicable, and the roll of a 20-sided dice. If the character has the advantage or disadvantage in a situation, then they roll 2 20-sided dice and take either the best result if they have the advantage or the worst result if they have the disadvantage. If the final roll exceeds a difficulty class, as set by the GM in opposed rolls, or their opponent's score in an opposed roll, then they have succeeded in their action. Having read previous editions of D&D and many RPGs that have, at least in part or in full, been based on them, I was expecting a lengthy slog through a huge bucket load of rules in this chapter. However, I was gratified to find that the actual core rules of the system are fairly brief and concise, covering only 8 pages, and that includes examples, explanations, and a lot of very beautiful artwork. Now, I'm a big fan of tight rule systems with a solid core mechanic, rather than systems where each separate situation just has another rule bolted haphazardly onto the normally fairly shaky whole. So I was very pleased to see that the main rules could be summed up and explained so concisely. Chapter 8 is titled Adventuring, and it covers numerous situations that might be faced during an adventure, such as tracking time, movement, etc. Now, while some of this chapter, especially the bits on time and movement segments, is a little dry, the book does not waffle on and it skips through subjects at a brisk, concise pace. Most situations seem to involve granting the advantage or disadvantage, or imposing a condition on the player characters. A condition is just a convenient label to represent an alteration of a PC's capabilities. For example, an unconscious creature is incapacitated, can't move or speak, and is unaware of their surroundings. The creature drops whatever it is holding and falls prone. It automatically fails strength and dexterity saving throws. Attack rolls against the creature have the advantage, and any attack that hits the creature from within 5 feet counts as a critical hit. Now, I'm always intrigued when I come across a section on social interaction in RPGs, since in my opinion, social interaction's one main advantage is that it doesn't require a lot of dice rolling, although I can certainly see the argument for rolling dice if you're playing a character whose social abilities outstrip your own. I do like that 5th edition stresses the actual roleplay components of social interaction equally as much as the ability check, suggesting a mixture of the two to achieve optimum results. I think this is a good compromise, since it allows for players to roleplay in those situations, but also gives them a bit of a boost should their characteristic scores warrant it. The chapter also covers downtime activities that take place between adventures, and contains a nice simple system for crafting, where effectively, for each day a craftsman spends working, he may craft 1 or more items with a market value of 5 gold pieces or less, expending raw materials worth half the market value. Crafting something worth more than 5 gold pieces simply involves upping the cost of raw materials and spending longer working on it. Resting, research and training are also covered in this chapter and have similarly streamlined systems. As we move on to Chapter 9, which deals with combat, you have to admit that whether you enjoy it or not, combat plays a huge part in many RPGs, and D&D is no exception. There are no real surprises in this chapter. After a surprise round, initiative is rolled using a dex check, and then play proceeds in turns around the table, each person making a move and taking an action. This is, unsurprisingly, one of the more rulesy chapters of the book, covering various combat states, positioning in combat, and the different actions that can be performed. However, it manages to do this without getting too close to becoming a skirmish wargame. Although there is plenty of crunch in the chapter for those who like it, it thankfully doesn't devolve into precise measurements and the grid systems common to some games. Again, for a rulesy chapter, it's fairly short, 9 pages or so in total, but it manages to cover everything you need to run a combat, from initiative to damage resistance to healing to dying from wounds. I think it's a testament to the skill of the writers that so much useful information can be fit into such a small page count. And as I said earlier, a lot of these pages include art as well. The final part of the book, part 3, begins with chapter 10 that covers spellcasting, and it begins with a discussion of the different types of spellcaster in the game. Effectively, there are two main types. One has a limited selection of spells which are always stored in their memory, such as bards and sorcerers, whilst the others, such as wizards and clerics, prefer their spells in advance, using the well-known and either loved or hated Vancian magic system. Now, if you're not aware of what that is, effectively, Vancian magic means that you spend time memorising the formula that make up a spell, but once you've cast it, that information is gone from your mind until you rest and restudy it. Now, some people like the Vancian system, some people don't, but it is and always has been a core part of D&D, so it wasn't a surprise to see it here. However, there are other options and other classes available should you not fancy using it. One interesting extra that I don't remember seeing in other versions of D&D, although I may be wrong, is that a spellcast with a higher level slot than is necessary upgrades itself to count as a higher level spell, and it may inflict more damage or a longer term effect depending on the description of the individual spell. This chapter also sees a welcome return for cantrips, minor charms that require no spell slot or advanced preparation and that can be cast at will. Now, I've always loved cantrips since they give a spellcaster something to fall back on once the majority of their magic is spent, rather than them just becoming a dead weight and a burden on the rest of the party. Plus, I find working out how to get the best in a situation from a low-powered cantrip to be a great role-playing challenge as well as an intellectual exercise. Some spells in the game can be cast as rituals, and this is a concept I certainly remember seeing in 4th edition. A ritual version of the spell in 5th edition takes 10 minutes longer to cast than normal and doesn't expend a spell slot. Although only certain casters can use rituals, I think this is a great idea since it rewards the spellcaster who plans in advance, and it also seems thematically appropriate to certain classes, like clerics and druids, to cast magic via a longer and more involved ceremony. There's some final brief discussion of component types, spells area of effect, and then we dive straight into a fairly comprehensive list of spells with Chapter 11. Each spellcasting class has a list of spells from 0 level, cantrips, up to level 9. The spells then have more detailed descriptions listed in alphabetical order. There are a lot of old favourite spells here, such as Alarm, Magic Missile, Bark Skin, Reincarnation, etc. But also there are some interesting new versions of spells, such as Augury, where you divine the future through omens, and Hunter's Mark, where you lay a mystical rune down on your quarry, enabling you to more easily hunt it. Some of the spells in this section are more interesting than others, but that is only to be expected. With the final chapter read through, we come to the appendices of the book, and Appendix A provides a handy quick reference of the various conditions that may afflict a character during the game. This will be extremely handy during a session to minimise page flipping. Appendix B provides a smattering of pantheons from various real-world inspirations and D&D campaign settings, giving some minimal detail on them. Now, whilst I expect that these will be detailed further in future supplements, I think you'd be hard-pressed to run deities convincingly using the 5th Ed Players Handbook without first doing some additional research, but I expect the Dungeon Master's Guide will have more on this. Appendix C gives a brief overview of the multiverse and the various planes of existence that forms it. This is all very interesting and reminds me of the old Planescape Gazetteer, for those who remember the Planescape AD&D setting. It also seems to meld together concepts from both the 3rd and 4th editions of the game, although I don't know that you could actually make a lot of use of this appendix without doing some supporting work. It's nevertheless a very interesting brief look into the multiverse. Finally, Appendix D is a brief bestiary containing some very abbreviated stat blocks for animals and a random assortment of low-level creatures, although orcs are a curious omission given that half-orcs are included as a playable race, and I really think you'd be struggling to run anything other than the most basic adventure using these abbreviated stat blocks. In conclusion, I think that D&D 5th edition seems like a very tight, very well written system. It has a streamlined set of rules and has thus been able to devote a large amount of the book to providing extra options and customization ideas for the players and giving advice and pointers on how to get the most out of your role playing, which is a great thing. I very much believe that this is the most polished version of D&D that I have seen yet, and would certainly be my edition of choice were I to run a D&D campaign. However, my only concern with regards to whether D&D 5th Ed will be a commercial success is that, given the plethora of other RPGs out there, D&D is no longer the only game in town. And whilst in my opinion this is probably the version of D&D that I prefer, certainly as far as I'm concerned the best that I've read to date, I'm not sure if it's going to have enough of an impact to draw fans in from other games, especially the number of far cheaper independent games out there, some of which now have a very professional look and feel to them. I do hope, however, that I'm wrong and that D&D 5th edition does prove to be a massive commercial success. Given the effort that has clearly gone into making the game and building on what has gone before, I'm very much looking forward to playing it in the future and seeing what supplements are released. It will be a terrible, crying shame to see the great granddaddy of all role-playing games fading into obscurity. So, if you have the money and you're looking for an extremely well-written and beautiful book, although as I say, I freely admit it's not the cheapest of books, a book that has this D&D feel to it, but has trimmed down on unnecessary rules to give a more focused, streamlined gaming experience, then you cannot go far wrong with this book. I highly recommend it. And if you maybe don't have the money but you are interested, as I say, I'm going to put a link down below to the free play rules. Give them a quick look, and that might spur your interest on to eventually investing in the main game. So I hope if you've enjoyed this review and this video, you'll click on like and click on the red dice up in the corner there to subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week. Until I see you in my next video, thank you very much for watching and for listening. Take care.